And joining us now on the debate in Calgary, Alberta, Catherine Marshall, law student at the University of Calgary. In the nation's capital, Nicole Goodman, PhD candidate at Carleton University. With us here in studio, Ali Rahman, who sells ads on social media. Yves Guillaume-Messy, student at the University of Toronto. Grayson Johnson, student at the University of Guelph. And Fenwick McKelvey, PhD student with Ryerson and York Universities. Great to welcome everybody around the table and to our guests out of town. It's nice to have you on the program tonight. Two things before we start. Number one, I got a tweet today from someone who said, you never have young people on the program. So to whoever sent me the tweet, eat your heart out. We got lots of young people here tonight. Number two, Fenwick McKelvey.
It's true.
That is the best name I've ever heard from anybody. How old are you?
29.
That is an awesome name.
It's the only one on the internet, apparently.
I bet you it is. I bet you it is. Well, as we consider the question of whether or not, quote unquote, the kids are all right, we're going to play some tape. But before I do that, I want to remind everybody that, of course, we call this Your Agenda on Thursdays because you're a part of the broadcast. And to that end, our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, is hosting a live chat on our Inside Agenda blog. Hook us up at tvo.org/theagenda or go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/theagenda. You can send us a tweet at twitter.com, #YourAgenda. Please jump in. We'll get your comments up on the screen as we always do throughout the course of the broadcast. Now, Rick Mercer, Jesse Hirsch, they had a little tete-a-tete on the issue, on the issues that we're going to be talking about this evening. So let's start by playing some tape, and then we'll come back and talk. Michael Smith, if you would, roll tape.
Everyone is targeted except for one group, the youth vote. There are more than 3 million young eligible voters in this country, and as far as any of the political parties are concerned, you might as well all be dead. In fact, in some elections, in Quebec, for example, the dead have a higher voter turnout. It is the conventional wisdom of all political parties that young people will not vote, and the parties, they like it that way. This time around, do the unexpected. Take 20 minutes out of your day and do what young people all over the world are dying to do. Vote.
On the one hand, you can't bully people into voting. But on the other hand, it kind of ignores the reason why people aren't voting. And I think part of the cliche in an electoral process is the criticism that if you don't vote, you can't criticize. If you don't vote, you can't participate. And that's kind of hogwash. There's lots of ways to get involved politically. Voting, perhaps the least of them.
Nice try, Jesse. That wasn't bad. But Rick is the master of that move, that's for sure, in the rant. Okay, let's go around on this. Catherine Marshall, do you believe that if you don't vote, you can't criticize?
No, not necessarily. I think if you don't vote, you could probably maybe have less validity to criticize. But I just want to comment on, you know, one of the problems with this whole vote mob thing is Rick Mercer is telling young people that they should vote and that their vote matters, but he's not actually explaining why. And I think that's why young people don't vote. They don't actually understand why their vote actually matters. And none of these campaigns really tell young people that.
Nicole, do you want to follow up on that? Do young people not vote because they don't see how their vote matters?
I would definitely agree with that. As a follow-up to the criticism point, I think that a lot of young people nowadays view voting more in terms of the rights dimension as opposed to the duty, and they focus on their right not to vote. So they sort of protest, they don't vote as a criticism to government.
Fen, do you think you have the right not to vote?
I think that not voting is a form of criticism at a time. You were looking at a very disaffected youth that is somewhat quite cynical of the political process, and at times, if they feel the best way of expressing their political opinion is by not showing up, there's something to be said in that.
Yves, what do you say?
Well, I have to say, I mean, it's not the best form of criticism, I find, because not voting is a confirmation that you don't matter at all. You're the one losing the fight. So usually you want to make sure you at least can play a part in the system. If you don't do that, you're just talking.
Ali?
Well, I think what's interesting is that while we have the right not to vote, we don't have the right to spoil our ballots, incidentally. That's illegal.
We do provincially, I think, but not federally. Yeah, that's right. So you can't do it this election.
Yeah, so you can't take an action, take a voting action that speaks to your disaffection with the political system. Now, I mean, the issue, Nicole raised the issue immediately, or Catherine, sorry, that young people aren't being, you know, no one's discussing why it's important that they vote. And I'm not sure that there are sort of valid points in terms of the issues that you brought up, that this election, so this is a budget election, you know, does it matter that we vote. And you know, the discussions I've had with young people who lean slightly outside the 18 to 24 dem that you described, they've all, you know, they all seem highly informed and concerned, but simply disconnected from all of the parties.
Well, Grayson, he says it's a budget election. A, I think budgets matter, and B, that's certainly Mr. Harper's view. Mr. Ignatiev's view is that it's about more than just the budget, it's also about how we do democracy in the country. Do young people not care about that?
I think that young people care a lot about democracy, and maybe I'm the youngest, most ideological person in this crowd, but I really think that our vote isn't just about us. Our vote is, it is a duty to the country, because all of us need to be saying what we care about. And if we're not going to do that, then it's going to shape the politics of this country in a way that doesn't embrace youth at all. And if we ever want our vote to be worth anything, then we need to make sure that we do that. It's not a lot to ask of people.
Finn?
I think it's also important to put this election in context. This comes after the prorogation of Parliament, where we saw Canadians advocating against proroguing Parliament, campaigning on Facebook and getting a massive number of people in cities across Canada, and then the G20 in Toronto here, both which would be times of youth being highly engaged in politics, and that falling on deaf ears, apparently. So if we're talking about one of the problems about why youth aren't being engaged, is are their voices being listened to? You know?
And the interesting flip side to that is the usage-based billing campaign, which happened on Facebook essentially via open media.
Better explain what that is.
The usage-based billing campaign, well, the CRTC was regulating towards allowing the major telecom companies, Bell and Rogers, to permit, they were going to charge essentially their resellers, which are smaller internet service providers like TechSavvy or Primus or whomever, they were going to charge them retail rates, basically, which would drive up the cost of internet. It's
way more for those who use way more bandwidth.
Yeah, exactly. And so it violates net neutrality principles, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a good thing
and young
for the
people were
internet.
interested in that issue.
Yeah, and they were certainly interested about that issue.
Movies.
And they, and they do a whole bunch of other stuff too.
Yes, okay.
Yes, they download movies. And that issue was presented as a clear-cut issue. It happened on social media channels where the young people are, and they took action.
And they got interested. Yves?
I mean, there's one thing here. I mean, it's true that the internet itself billing is a key issue to youth, but let's bring the whole context back. I mean, voting is an opportunity. It's a referendum on sort of who should be leading. And a lot of people right now, they're telling me, do you trust Stephen Harper? That's really what it comes down to every few years when elections happen. And young people do have that, as Philip mentioned, that momentum of political sort of passion that needs to be expressed. So yes, in that sense, they would be shown to matter at all. They do matter in the political system in that they care, and this is an outlet when they can actually let it out.
Catherine, go ahead.
I actually think one of the reasons why we have a low voter turnout, not just with youth, but with all Canadians, is that the media drives down voter turnout. And they do this by forcing all the leaders to essentially say the same thing, because anytime a political leader tries to say anything radical or sort of different, they get completely, crucified for it. And young people do tend to be more ideological and more purist when it comes to their views. And what they're really looking for is difference and conflict and, a real choice between leaders. The healthcare is a great example. It's become a huge issue in this campaign, yet all the leaders have basically come out and said, well, we're just going to keep throwing money at a broken system. I mean, could you imagine if one of the leaders said, actually, let's start talking about healthcare reform? And I think with young people, they're really looking to see their vote matter, in that they want to vote for someone that is really strong on their convictions and views, and they kind of don't see a difference between any of the leaders.
Well, let me try this with Nicole. You are all young and handsome and beautiful, and I, don't need the hospital system very much right now. So why would, whether a party can really promise 6% escalating increases in a new health accord between now and whenever the new health accord kicks in, why would that engage you? Nicole, you want to take a kick at that one? Exactly.
I don't know
necessarily.
I did want to comment, though, on what Catherine said and about why I think that young people today aren't voting.
You're dodging my question, eh? Because there is listen, I think that's a perfect example. That's why young people, but okay, I think I made my point. Now you go ahead and make yours.
One of the main reasons that I don't think there's one reason that's wholly explanatory for the phenomenon of non-voting among youth, but I do think that one of the major factors is a sense of civic duty among young people, and I think that senses of civic duty among young people are changing and transforming. So they're no longer the traditional duty that demands a vote in every single election. This is what my thesis research is looking at. What we found, or what I found so far, is that young people today conceive of duty as something being conditional or contingent. They look at it as being contingent in two respects. One is contingent on information. So, for example, if a young person has been paying attention or they're very informed, they feel like they have a greater duty to vote, a heightened sense of duty to vote in that particular election. Whereas if they haven't been paying attention or they're not informed, they feel it's socially acceptable not to vote. And in fact, it's actually more responsible to do so. The other way they look at it is something I've called meaning, importance, and closeness. The meaning being the stakes of the election. If a young person perceives the stakes of an election to be high, closeness of the race, and importance, major differences between parties and candidates. So those contextual factors, depending on the stakes of an election, if there's a big difference between parties and candidates, if young people perceive that, they are more likely to vote and they feel a heightened sense of duty to vote. So the sense of duty for young people nowadays is no longer about an election that demands a vote every time. It's no longer about voting for the meaning and the health of democracy. It's about voting under certain conditions.
I got you, Nicole. Okay, let's do Grayson and then Eve.
Nicole, I really like that you've quantified this with research, because this is something that I've experienced in talking to students throughout campus. And one of the things I'm noticing is that students are not apathetic. They are totally engaged in voting. However, they feel that they don't know enough to make an informed vote. And that's a very sad thing, because I think that students, by definition, since they're educated, should have probably a better idea than a lot of people of what they should be. Why don't they vote?
Yeah. No, why are they not educated or up on the issues in a way that you think they should be?
Well, it is quite hard to follow it. It's hard to keep on top of things, and you almost feel like you don't know anything unless you can speak knowledgeably on everything. I mean, I can't speak knowledgeably on everything, I know that for certain, but I can speak very knowledgeably on certain things, and that is why I determine my vote.
Eve?
Well, actually, I find that you mentioned that there's a difference between a referendum and an election, and I find that there's a trend in Canadian politics in focusing elections on particular minute issues, like the healthcare intricacies of a healthcare plan, when youth really don't have to vote on that particular issue, but more on the fact that they don't want Stephen Harper to keep doing what he's doing. There's a good website going on right now, Stuff Harper Did.
Sorry, what's it called?
That's not quite what it says.
Stuff Harper Did. It's currently really popular among youth. Hey, this is youth and social media.
Hang on. And you know what? I appreciate that.
CRTC.
I was going to say you're cleaning it up for us, but tell us what it's really called.
Well, shit Harper did. .com. I think it's .com. And I mean, I'm more of a conservative persuasion, so I didn't really touch the website. But I mean, it's really popular, and it shows the dissent that people have about sort of other things than the intricacies of the healthcare plans. So I mean, should we have referendums, or should we have elections on global issues? Well, global by the overall picture, not just retirees, individual impediment 5 years from now.
Finn.
Well, what I think is interesting, and getting back to Catherine's comment about kind of this antagonism that happens, is that Stephen Harper has been immensely polarizing when it comes to the online youth. And if you look at Shit Harper Did, there's also things Stephen Harper does to seem human.tumblr.com. And then a friend of mine, we're looking at Mem Generator, which is a popular website to kind of generate those funny pictures of cats trying to eat cheeseburgers that your friends email you. And then that is full of pictures making fun of Stephen Harper. So in a way, there has been a lot of dissent by youth concerned about Harper, and they've been voicing in the way they know how, which is kind of on jokes and viral videos on the internet.
You know he's the closest in age to all of you, though. You know that, eh? Of all the leaders.
And he loves kittens.
So we understand.
I actually think another interesting point, and this goes to why young people aren't voting, is because young people of all the demographics tend to be the most optimistic about the future, about their personal future. And when you're optimistic and excited about the future and you think things are going well, you're less, I think, likely to want to vote to change things. But then you look at another demographic, seniors, for example, who are probably a little less optimistic about things, and they want to vote and to make changes, to change their personal situation and to make the future better for themselves. And that's a demographic where the voter turnout is very high, and you do see a lot of parties, like all the parties, that have huge policy positions devoted to this demographic.
A lot of targeting of seniors in this race, too. Grayson, I'm going to ask our director to show some video right now that you are all too well aware of. This is called, and again, for some of our older viewers who may not know, this is called, I guess some people call it a flash mob, I guess you call it a vote mob.
Yes.
What's going on here?
Right now, we are sneaking up on Stephen Harper. So conveniently, Stephen Harper was stopping in Guelph, very close to the University Centre, and we wanted to throw him a surprise party to show him that students are voting. Because apparently people think that we're not. So we want to.
They're not really, are they?
Oh, they are. Actually, we had an advanced poll on campus for the past 3 days.
The voter turnout is really low, though, for students.
Well, I don't know if it will be this time around. We just had an advanced poll on campus, and we had 700 students cast their ballot, waited 2 hours in line during exams. Everyone's excited about it. As my friend says, it's become socially unacceptable to say that you're not voting on campus.
My question is, like, are these things like Vote Mob and Rock the Vote in the U.S., do these things actually result in more young people voting? Like, look at the 2008 presidential election. Obama had all of these measures to encourage young people to vote, and his turnout of youth voters was actually not that high.
Well, I guess we'll see. We'll see when the election comes around.
Yeah.
And
you think it's worth giving it a shot?
I think it's worth giving it a shot. Absolutely, it's worth it during exam period, and I'll keep doing this until we do see results.
Fenwick.
But I think it's undeniable that Obama's ability to mobilize the youth was certainly instrumental to his success, political success. Yes. I mean, certainly as a candidate for change and bringing that into his message. And what I find fascinating is the Obama campaign, particularly with its savviness use of social media and different ways of bringing people into the campaign, not necessarily in a more democratic, but in a more controlled and managed campaign. Those types of policies haven't necessarily transitioned into Canada. How are we seeing political parties using social media or the media more popular among youth to actually connect with them?
Well, let me give a real concrete example that, okay, we appreciate the fact that, pension reform may not grab young people because they're not worrying about pensions when you're in your teens and 20s, maybe when you're in your 50s and 60s. Similarly, the guaranteed income supplement, I can understand why that doesn't grab young people either. Post-secondary transfers from the federal government to the provinces so that we can have good, high quality universities, you would think, Nicole, would be a big issue that, young people would care about. I mean, this hits you where you live, theoretically. Is it?
Yeah, you would think it would be.
Doesn't sound like it is, though.
Well, who's tackling that issue on the party level? I mean, it's sort of, and it's expected that it's included in the NDP platform. It's sort of the Liberals and the Conservatives all pay lip service to student issues and student rights and tuition, but no one's really made it a campaign issue.
By the way, there's something I find I should raise in this point. We're talking about education reform, and let's take the example of the University of Toronto, one of the biggest universities in Canada, the biggest probably.
The biggest.
And that tuition debate, you have the student union that's typically very NDP, that's representing students and fighting for that every inch of every dollar of tuition to being reduced. But that actually ends up dividing and alienating the average person who doesn't necessarily care about $50 being charged every year. So you have a situation where on campuses, individual factions where students are more interested, the more radical students, more likely to be involved, actually repel the average person.
Nicole, come on back in. You had the floor and then lost it for a second. Come on back in here and make the point you wanted to make.
Oh, I was just going to say, I just finished teaching a class at Carleton called Youth and Political Participation, and so obviously we discussed the election and everything, and what my students, they're all first-year students, so 17, 18, 19 years old, they all expressed that they have similar election issues, or their election issues are similar to older people, but I think they lack a confidence in the fact that they're going to actually see these promises actually come through. They lack a confidence in government, so they don't have the same sort of trust in politicians.
I wonder, Catherine, if that's a bit of a cop-out. It's very kind of cool and easy to say, they're all the same, we don't have to pay any attention, it's not going to have any influence on me. Does that give young people kind of a license not to engage in this political process because they think it's cool for some reason?
I think that's a giant cop-out, and actually I think that it's interesting to hear sort of the perspective on why youth do and do not vote from inside the ivory tower and all this research, when most people don't trust their politicians, period. It's not just young people. And I think that it simply comes down to the question of, young people do not vote because nobody explains to them why their vote matters. And all of these campaigns to push the youth vote, and they're horrific campaigns, especially the ones run by Elections Canada, because they're run by people who could never imagine not voting. And the message just doesn't translate.
Let me try this with you, Eve.
I completely disagree with that.
Oh, you do? All right. you go ahead, and then I'll get to Eve in a second. Go ahead.
I was just looking online last night, like in preparation for today and thinking about everything. I have never before seen so many different organizations develop, not just with academics, but like civil society, grassroots groups, to encourage people to vote and to impart the importance of voting upon young people, as I have recently. Like, I just think it's amazing the number of groups that are developing and trying to encourage young people to vote. At Carleton
But they're not
University,
being effective.
But how do you know that? How can you say how can you say they're not generating results?
Well, because all of these things existed in 2008 as well, and the youth vote was very low too. And I'm going to hold out on this election and see if the youth vote actually increases. But I have to think that a lot of these efforts just aren't actually resulting in the kind of in this higher youth vote turnout.
Finn wants to make a point.
I just think the question is, again, how much of this is not having a turnout or just showing that not voting is a political act? I mean, I think that's a fundamental thing that needs to be put on the table here. And if you have political parties who don't seem to be engaging with the youth vote or have been systematically ignoring it in the case of the prorogation or the G20, then what is the reason youth are voting? And I think that you not only can put this accountability on youth, but also needs to be put on politicians as well. Why aren't we seeing more direct changes, as in the case of stuff that Obama was doing in the United States?
Let me try this with Eve. You run an NGO?
A few, yes.
A few. What kind of issues are you into?
Well, it's mostly, coming from an African country, there's a strong sort of immigrant slant that I have here, but we're dealing with microfinance and social enterprise in international development.
So if there is a disaffection with sort of mainline political parties in Canada with young people, do you see it as well in your line of work? Is there a disaffection with NGOs and the kind of work you're doing?
Not at all. Actually, people care very strongly about international issues. There's that aspect of being Canadian that leads you to think global. And local issues, usually, the people who care the most usually get involved in many individual ways. People lobby, people get involved with their favorite politicians, writing activities. From the nonprofit side, people just go to Cuba and, build schools.
So we can't say that young people are kind of completely disaffected and blasé about everything.
Not at all.
It may just be partisan politics.
I'm passionate about. Yeah, partisan politics. There's a strong undercurrent of partisan politics excluding the people who are not willing to play the game. If you don't want to make the smiles and end up wanting to be the prime minister, you probably are more likely to just either join an NGO, join a community organization, or do something that's probably going to get more results than just voting for someone who will end up winning anyway.
Grayson.
I can certainly see where you're coming from. I have an international development degree. That's what I'm doing at school. So everyone around me is all NGOs is all we talk about. And I really think that we need to consider, though, that this is not a lot to ask of people. If we're just letting people get away with not voting, then how are we ever going to have a chance of changing the system?
But I think you're undercutting the action of not voting as an action itself. Like withdrawing assent, basically, as I don't know if Nietzsche would call it that way.
If that's the reason it's happening. If it's happening because you're bored or not interested or you want to sleep
basically,
in.
it's not the lack of will to get involved. It's basically a vote. People vote by not voting, interestingly enough.
I don't know if we can say that with certainty. I think that the action that people can take, which isn't illegal, is to leave a blank ballot. I think it's unfortunate that the engagement that we're asking for is defined. Steve, you saw that debate. Canadians are certainly concerned about issues, and there were 6 people who asked some really great issue-driven questions to the leaders, and you could have asked any of them, hey, what color is the sky? And the answer would have been, he's a liar, and it's his fault. And so there's, if we want to cast blame on why there's disaffection or disengagement with the electoral system, then I think it falls in the hands of Parliament and the structure of government right now. We don't have proportional representation. Jack brought that up. I thought it was actually very big of him to even mention that the Bloc gets 1.3 million popular votes, the Greens get 900,000, the Bloc has 50 some odd seats, and the Greens have 0. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to say. The last several elections, we've been asked to vote strategically. You know, depending, I'm from Quebec, where you basically have two choices. It's either liberal or separatist.
Well, depends what riding you're in.
Right. And actually, I was in
don't
Mulclair's
you-
riding, which was a very exciting change. It was one of the first times that, you know, we've seen that kind of action.
In Gatineau, you got 4 choices. They got a strong 4-way campaign in Gatineau.
That's
Catherine,
true.
come on in.
I think that the argument that some people make that a way to encourage more voter engagement is to change our electoral system is completely flawed. Look at 1988. That was the election on free trade, and voter turnout was at, like, I think 75%. And that's because that was an election where people had real choice. There was an issue, the different parties had different positions on that issue, and there was a difference and competition between the leaders, and that's why people voted. And I think when it comes to engaging young people, and just any voters in general, is the party leaders need to get out there, they need to have bold policy positions, they need to differentiate themselves from one another, and actually have a bit of guts when they're, you know, when they're actually speaking on issues and presenting their positions. People really crave that competition between their political leaders.
Fenn.
Oh, Catherine, I think that's a fascinating point, but it kind of makes me question, because you saw the Liberal Party putting on their video soon after someone was dejected from a rally for having a picture with her and Michael Ignatieff, and they came out with a really strategic, tactical video soon thereafter. And you see this kind of attempt to kind of antagonize or go after the, you know, Stephen Harper in the case of Michael Ignatieff, but yet how this is not kind of seemed to have, you know, manifested in a sense of strong differentiation between.
Yeah, exactly. It's not actually resonating. It's not actually creating real policy differences between the parties. And the reality is that all of the leaders are kind of stuck in the mushy middle. But when young people are so ideological and they're purist when it comes to their beliefs, and I think they're just really craving that boldness, and it's just not there.
Well, let me follow up with on Catherine's point here with you, Grayson. One of the most significant differences among the parties right now is the Conservative position that corporate taxes are okay where they are, and the Liberal and NDP position, which is they ought to go up 1.5 points. 18%. Right, from 16.5 to 18%. If the most significant, well, maybe it's not the most, if one of the most significant differences among our political parties in this country is 1.5 points on the corporate sales tax, not sales tax, on corporate tax, you know, is that worth going to the barricades over?
Well, I think that whatever percent it is indicates a different set of values between parties. And I think that students are receptive to the differences between.
Is it a big enough difference, though, to get students to be receptive?
On that issue, perhaps no. But I think that there are so many other issues that there is a the environment.
You think one party is dramatically better than one of the others?
Absolutely.
You want to tell us which one?
Well, I think that there's certainly a party that doesn't have good environmental policy.
Which one?
Or a record, at least.
Or absolutely.
Which
well, you
one?
know what? Actually, the Conservative Party was not always the environmental bad guy. When Brian Mulroney was in, they were not bad.
Different Conservative Party.
Exactly.
And which party today do you think represents the environment better than the present Conservative Party?
The Green Party would be the natural option.
Yeah.
But all of them, really.
All of the others
Yes.
would be better. Okay. Let me hearken back to this idea I heard earlier that you have, if you don't follow the issues and you're really not up on things, Nicole, do you have a duty not to vote? I heard somebody say that earlier. You have a duty not to vote if your vote really isn't based on a careful consideration of the issues and a real thorough understanding of the issues. What do you think of that?
Well, that's what young people are saying. They're saying it's like almost a two-tier duty. They have a duty to be informed first, and then if they can be informed, then they have a duty to vote. But if they can't be informed, it's more responsible to abstain. It's about the quality of the vote as opposed to quantity of the vote.
I think that's a really interesting point. I was on a taxi on the way over here. It was a Pakistani guy. He was a civil engineer. He was frustrated that he was driving a cab, and he was a staunch liberal. And here, you know, where the Conservatives did recently, and I'm not endorsing them, but the Conservatives did recently announce a policy for retraining of foreign professionals, right? And that would speak directly to like the main issue that is confronting him on a daily basis. But he is a staunch liberal, and it's not necessarily. I mean, I think there's a lack of information happening there, but people vote on passion, and that's a problem. And people vote on sort of their perception of ideology. The NDP party is no longer the hard left Labour Party. They've become a sort of soft left center party. The Liberals, I mean, I don't know where they stand on anything. There's gradations that just fold through all of the parties right now. I can't sort of pick a single stance.
Catherine, you want to come in?
Yeah, I was going to say something about this. People have talked about engaging youth by giving them issues that they can be excited about, issues that are maybe pertinent to their lives as students and young people. But I actually think that one of the reasons why young people are disengaged is because parties think the only way to engage young people is to, give them nuggets of, things in their platforms that are good for students. Like, don't treat young people like they're in sandbox politics. I think one of the things, I think that's kind of patronizing, like treat young people like they're equal just to everybody else. And that's actually one thing the Conservative Party does do is, they don't have a youth wing, but they also don't believe in sandbox politics. And one of the reasons why I got involved in the Conservative Party was I felt like I could have a real voice. I wasn't just going to be the token youth person.
Gotcha. Okay, well, we're having this discussion in Calgary, in Ottawa, and around our table here in Toronto. People are having it online as well. We call our Thursday programs Your Agenda because our fifth column blogger, Mike Miner, moderates an online chat at tvo.org/theagenda. Mike, come on in from your undisclosed location, which I actually know where it is tonight.
Keep it to yourself, Steve.
Okay, I won't tell a soul. Tell us what people are saying online.
Well, most of the people on the chat tonight are around 25 or younger based on what they've been saying. One person says that he's, like the people on the panel of the show, pretty well-educated person and not representative of the young people who don't vote. He goes by the name Mike Miner fan, so he really is a man of uncommon taste. And he says that a lot of people he knows that don't vote, and in general, the younger people don't vote because they do think that's a political statement. And sometimes also that people don't know what they should be voting for, and they feel that it's more responsible of them not to. So they do agree with that. And as far as the issues that are being focused on the younger voters, a lot of times they don't particularly respond well to being lumped in with a bunch of other youth. They do see that as patronizing, some people are saying. And other times the issues that they're interested in just kind of confuse them. Thirsty Mind pointed out how many people he talks to who don't understand that education isn't really in the federal bailiwick, and that they get frustrated when it's not being discussed as much as they would like to hear it. Semra Sevi, who was actually an intern at the Agenda, said that it's not true that students don't care. Many students watched the leaders debate this year and updated their Facebook and Twitter, and there has been a lot of conversation about social media. A lot of people think it can be the thing that really brings the youth voters in, while other people are saying, yeah, they might update their Facebook and Twitter, but even still, they then are not necessarily going to vote. People do follow these things online, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to decide on an issue, find a candidate they like, and on May 2nd, get up out of their apartment and go and vote. Okay, Mike, thanks. Keep moderating away. And once again, tvo.org/theagenda if people want to get in and weigh in with their views, and we'll put them up on the screen throughout the rest of the broadcast. Do you want to pick up on that last point, that people may follow it on Facebook and Twitter, but that doesn't necessarily mean they'll get up off the couch and vote?
Well, I think this is actually one of the biggest problems when we talk about social media and the potential of it to reframe or renew democracy, is that during the debate, the English leader debate, there's 35,000 tweets going on during this time. And yet, how much could people follow that? I mean, the myth, I think, a lot about what's going on with social media is that you can say whatever you want, but how many people are listening? And I think what the concern is, especially when calling this a Twitter election, is that it brings with it all the positive connotations of Twitter, but none of the actual accountability of having it so you can say something and then people will listen to it.
Nicole, what's your view on that?
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I had a thought. I was going to ask if can I raise a couple points?
Yeah, go ahead.
That are relevant. Just one of the things he said about the one young man was sort of offended that they're treating youth as sort of a homogenous group, and I just wanted to make the point that in my research as well, I think it is a problem, and I found that young people today are not a homogenous group. You can't say that they're political dropouts. You can't say that they're politically engaged, because there are certainly both those types of groups, but there's also a middle ground group as well, and people, variations, nuances. So you can't say young people today are political dropouts or politically engaged. And the other thing I wanted to raise, we're talking about motivations for voting, and I was wondering about, we talked a lot about issues, I'm wondering about accessibility. And one of the things that I study and I'm really interested in is internet voting, and I wanted to kind of ask how everyone else in the panel what they thought about that. If the introduction of internet voting perhaps for young people might make the process more convenient, more accessible, and maybe would encourage turnout.
That's a great question. Ali, why don't you go on that first? You make your living trying to sell ads online. If we had e-voting so that you didn't have to leave the comfort of home, would that get the voter turnout up?
Yeah, I think it would certainly drive up turnout. I'm not sure if that would be a long-term and sustained change to the way people react to politics, because I think that there's a larger issue to discuss, and that is, like, let's take a look not just at this debate, but the last 10 years of Canadian politics. And what you have is sort of systemic alignments and betrayal. You know, the NDP sold out their own values to prop that 2004 election that got the 2006, sorry, that got the Conservatives into power in the first place. That alienated a lot of voters from the NDP. We've had a minority government where we've been disconnected from action.
But what about e-voting?
I think e-voting will drive up the vote. I think it's a short-term solution.
But how?
Accessibility. I think you're absolutely right.
So if it's easier to vote, people will.
Are people not voting because it's inconvenient, or are they not voting because
I think it contributes to the reasons that people don't vote. But I mean, the idea that there's any one single cause behind the act or inact of not voting is also treating people as though they're a homogenous block.
Let's hear Eve on this.
I mean, you raise important issues, but we have to stress out technology is a means to an end. It's not the habit that will make us more democratic. So what Twitter will do, and Malcolm Gladwell kind of raised the objection, is that it's not the means, it's not the medium, it's the people with the message. And I find that, you know, it will increase voter turnout just in a sense that more people will be aware of issues going on, but it won't change the core dynamics of Canadian politics that have been excluding many of the people who are not willing to play the game.
I know we had a former minister, Ontario Minister of Democratic Reform on the program once, a woman named Marie Boutriani, who's actually running in the federal election right now in Hamilton. And she said, you know what, now she said 4 years, it happens to be more than that federally these days, but once every, whatever it is, 2, 3, 4 years, it's not asking too much to be a contributing citizen of your province, country, whatever, to have to actually go out, stand in a line for a few minutes, and put an X on a ballot. That is the least you can do. Does that take away from the e-voting thing?
I think that e-voting would be tremendously helpful, and I think a lot more people would do it. But just what I've noticed on campus, like I said, we had a pre-registration and we had a vote in campus, and everyone seemed to be so happy in line. They were studying in line, waiting hours there, and there was a sense of almost martyrdom. It was beautiful, actually, just how proud they were to be taking this time to do what they felt was right. And I think that's beautiful. I mean, there are ways it would be a lot easier. It would have been nice if I didn't have to wait an hour when I had an exam the next day. But I agree that we're not asking that much of people.
Okay, I'm told by the control room we've got an email here that we're going to pop up here. I haven't seen this yet, so let's throw it up, Michael, and see what we say. Blogs and other social media is infiltrated by volunteers, staffers, and liars who have an agenda. These social media participants are unregulated and are able to say anything. Signed, unpublishable. Well, we did publish you, so I guess you're going to have to change your handle there. You're not unpublishable anymore. Who wants in on that one? Go ahead, Fen.
Well, I was just thinking that it's also important when you're talking about, say, the connection between political parties and bloggers and social media, is that kind of strategic usage of bloggers. I mean, since the 2006 election, political parties have been leaking information to bloggers to test out whether that'll play well, to see whether they can create a scandal or diminish their opponents with actually not coming back to them. So if the idea, yeah, I think a lot of bloggers and social media can be considered to be inculcated with the party, but is that a question of, is this defeating the medium, or just showing a degree of cynicism that a lot of command and control political campaigns, depend on?
Nicole, what do you say?
I definitely think there's going to be cynicism in any form of medium that's used. The one cool thing about social media is that it's an interactive two-way medium. So there's the potential for dialogue and interaction between participants. So it's just not the one-way message or top-down method of communication that politicians are used to. Excuse me, sorry. Another thing that I think is really interesting is we see all these political actors reaching out and using social media and taking advantage of the opportunities. Civil society is actively using it, but we don't really see agencies like Elections Canada doing it. And I was thinking about Catherine's point earlier about how, none of the initiatives to encourage youth to vote are being effective. If Elections Canada or other election agencies made better use of social media to encourage young people and other groups of citizens to vote, could they perhaps be more successful? Would that be a good outreach initiative?
Oh no, bureaucrats trying to use social media. That scares me.
Scary, eh?
I mean,
Scary?
it's key. I mean, I find that social media will just amplify the core real dynamics. It's just that parties will use means that are accessible given their party funding to get the objectives that they're trying to get. And then you have social media as an economy of people who can't speak and fight against each other. So, I mean, that's the core thing. We have to change the core structure of Canadian politics, and not just the voting system, but really the appeal of it to like minority or just like fringe, voters, I find.
Let me raise the issue of, I guess what's been called micro-targeting of specific groups during the course of this campaign, which the Conservatives are either being criticized for or admired for, how either brazenly or skillfully they're doing it, depending on your point of view. We just had an email come up saying, young people are disengaged for a lot of reasons, but one of them is the only target demographic that the political parties care about are the boomers. And if you're not in the boomer group, then they don't care about you, and so they don't care about us, we don't care about them. Ali, does that resonate with you?
That the Conservative Party specifically
All of them.
is taking.
All of them.
Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, if looking at that last debate, this was a very budget-focused discussion, and it seems like a budget-focused election, and that certainly does have an impact to young people. We don't necessarily recognize the immediate payoffs or the immediate effects of that, and it's difficult to identify issues inside of budget proposals, right? Because we're looking at it in like the entirety of a proposal rather than sort of picking at things that we care about and may affect us. Now, earlier you brought up this issue of healthcare and why does or are we young and healthy and therefore does that issue not resonate with us, or why does it? And I think healthcare is a value issue in that it appeals to not necessarily our pragmatic needs, but it appeals to our sense of Canadian values. Like, this is Tommy Douglas's Canada, and this is Healthcare Canada, and we don't want to lose that. So that is something that I think young people, whether or not they're going to the hospital, are concerned about.
Catherine, then Fenn.
Yeah, and that's exactly why none of the political leaders want to touch that issue with a 10-foot pole, is because it really is wrapped up in people's sense of value. But just touching on Steve's point, because I think it's a really interesting point, that parties, and all parties do it, they target certain groups of people and they target demographics. The NDP, they target the women vote, and you can't say they don't because they do. And it comes down to resources. There's a spending limit in every election, and the parties sit down and they figure out how much money do we have, who votes out of Canadian people, who votes the most, who are we going to really expend these resources targeting? And the reality is that the electorate under the age of 25 is only 11%, and only about 5% of those people actually vote. And because young people really don't vote, parties might devote maybe one day of the campaign really reaching out to young people.
Fenn, then Eve.
Well, I was just going to say, touching on Ali's point about how it was framed as a budget debate, I think this brings a question that you can tie back to targeting and micro-targeting, is that the framing of the debate, especially after watching the English debate, is at the very end, Stephen Harper alluded to talking about alternative ways of service delivery, which I thought would be a much more controversial point that he would make, and yet that hasn't necessarily been picked up. And so is this because there's a certain kind of media consensus that the story they run with? And is this type of media consensus vastly different than the types of media that, quote unquote, the ethnic vote would be reading, kind of local journals, local newspapers, but also youth as well. I mean, 70%, Canadian Media Research Council just came out with a report that said the preferred source of media for most people from the age of 18 to 34 is the internet. So micro-targeting not only, certainly is tactical and at times a resource allocation, but also might speak to a real problem of whether we're seeing a greater degree of media fragmentation, so that we're not on the same page of the same newspaper.
Eve.
That's true. I mean, politics, being a student in political science, you find that, the political system, it's all a matter of who gets the most votes. And, being in the seat of a party kind of pollster, you want to focus on people who give you the votes. And that sometimes leads to some of us, not being heard, or, trying our best to be heard, but not being heard at the end of the day. And it's a matter of whether or not, as Canadians, we want to make sure that the debate itself includes everyone in a democratic kind of way, or it's just a matter of talking about the intricacy of the budget every single time, knowing that a certain middle class, typically Caucasian, will probably be the one most engaged with the issues. So it's a matter of how democratic are we?
Let's do Ali, and then I got another email we want to play.
The issue of micro-targeting is an interesting one because as an advertiser, right, you need to define your target audience in order to properly allocate your resources. You're absolutely right about that. Now, I think the problem it creates is that it feeds back into policy. By targeting a specific group of people and deciding that this is who you're going after, then you have to retailer the policy to, you have to retrofit the policy to fit with that target. And there you have, to Eve's point, you begin to exclude other conversations from the political discourse.
Okay, Michael, if you would, let's bring that next email up and we'll have a chat about that. Young people in the Arab world are ready to die for the right to vote. What better reason for all of us to vote? Okay, Eve, you want that one?
We're better off. Simply enough, the Canadian political system is, part of the problem that we have is that we're too well taken care of. The healthcare system, we have to worry about, minor inflation that the government kind of takes care of. There aren't a lot of issues that we would, comparatively, globally speaking, have to worry about compared to the average country. And it becomes a matter of, we have elections on budgets. That kind of shows the level of, the height of the concerns that we can afford to have at this point.
The fact is, Fen, it's not life and death here in the way that it was in Tahrir Square. And therefore, you can't expect, or can you? Can you expect young people to vote in the numbers here as they did over there?
No, but I think it's also important that we remember the demographics and the different demographics, because in Egypt and in Tunisia you saw a gigantic youth class being systematically impoverished, that no opportunities or affordances. And yet here, predominantly, the demographics are much more different. We don't have a sizable youth population. If it's getting back to, resource allocation, as Catherine was pointing out, are we seeing that type of ability of mobilizing to the numbers and mobilizing enough that it could drown out or counter, say, the baby boomer or the elderly? And if it's talking about, I think that's just an important thing to keep in mind, is that the demographics of Egypt and of Tunisia are very different than Canada.
Well, let me ask Catherine, do you think that young people here in Canada feel a tinge of guilt if they're not politically active or engaged or don't intend to vote when they watch their television sets and they see people their age in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, whatever, prepared to go into the public squares and die for the rights that we take for granted here?
Well, I think it definitely puts things in perspective for young people when you're looking on the news and you're seeing other people your age who are dying for that right to vote. And even it hits home. Like, my grandparents were refugees from Eastern Europe when they were my age, and we have a very different life in this country. Our generation is very fortunate, and we're very lucky. And unfortunately, people don't vote, and not just young people, because of complacency, because they don't really think that it matters, and there aren't those huge national issues that are really grasping, the electorate's attention.
Fen?
I just think it's also interesting that because of the internet and because of what's going on in Tunisia, that they're connected, that a lot of people actually were trying to get engaged, by retweeting, by trying to follow what's going on, so that, are youth not engaged? Well, in another part of the world, you saw youth trying to make sure in Canada that they're trying to support or standing in solidarity with the people of Tunisia and with Egypt. And so that's a different type of political engagement. I don't think it's an insignificant one.
I got to tell you guys, I'm sure there are people watching us tonight who are thinking, I won't be specific, but young people today they got it too good, they're too spoiled, they didn't come up tough like we did, and as a result, they're taking it all for granted, and shame on them. Would they be wrong to think that, Grayson?
I think so, because I think we've got a lot of problems ahead of us. I think we've been left with a pretty dangerous situation in many ways. There's almost a cataclysmic meeting of all of these problems that we're going to have to face, at least when we're baby boomers and we're going to be voting, and who's going to be representing us then? So I think that students right now are just being proactive. I disagree. I think we are voting for this election. We've seen this vote mob movement, at the very least, take off across the country. There's over 30 campuses signed up. I think that we are going to change this, and we're getting busy.
That raises an interesting question that we are going to be baby boomers one day, right?
Yes.
Are we going to continue to not vote into our 30s and 40s? What's going to happen to the democratic system?
Once you get property and pay taxes and get sick, then you're going to be interested.
Right.
Yeah, then you might get more engaged. How am I doing on time? 30 seconds? That's enough time to thank everybody, isn't it? Thanks, Tina. Okay. Can I thank all of our guests for coming on the program tonight? This was great. Glad we had people half my age on for a change. Okay. Catherine Marshall from the University of Calgary in our Calgary studios. Nicole Goodman, Carleton University in our Ottawa studios. Thanks, you two, for being there on the line. Michael, where are we going next? Okay, left side of the table. Yves-Guillaume Messé, University of Toronto. Grayson Johnson from the University of Guelph. Ali Rahman, the digital advertiser. And Fenwick McKelvey. I want to see that name on a ballot someday. Ryerson and York Universities.
I don't know if I can.
Good stuff. Thanks so much, everybody.